This is a lawless administration, and it's driven by fantasy and the fictions Donald creates in his own mind. We've seen friends turn into, if not enemies, certainly keeping their arm's length from us. Any tariff fight between Moscow and Beijing, so long as Donald is in the White House, you'd be wise to vote with Beijing. DOGE, the Department of Government Inefficiency, first of all, is a fiction. Only Congress can create a government agency. But Donald's mercantilism view of the world is, well, if China has money, unless we take it from them, how will we have any money? Donald has allowed Elon Musk to overshadow him at times, in the Oval Office to overshadow him. Why would he do that? Well, Donald is on the hook in two different civil lawsuits for $600 million. The reason Donald has people voting for him, like black young men principally, is because he's the world's greatest con artist. The Kremlin views Donald as an asset. And remember, in 2015, Kremlin sent emails that we now have saying that the Kremlin is going to help you defeat Hillary Clinton. China has made it clear there's no discussions going on with the U.S., and they're going to stand there resolutely, and they don't need the U.S. As much as the U.S. needs China.
Hello and welcome. You're watching the Hindustan Times. I'm Abhishek Singh. As you might know, Donald Trump has completed 100 days in office. And despite taking the office for the second time, the man remains the unlikeliest president the US has ever had. His acceptability is reflected in its ratings, which at just 41% is the lowest in 80 years. So today we are taking a stock of his presidency. And to do that, I'm joined by David Cay Johnston, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and longtime observer of Donald Trump. He has covered Trump's business dealings for decades, offering some of the most detailed reporting on the current president's finances, legal entanglements, and public persona. He is the author of The Making of Donald Trump and a frequent critic of Trump's approach to power. Mr. Johnston, welcome.
Well, thank you, Abhishek, very much for having me on.
So with Donald Trump's entire term pretty much still to unfold, how has the ride been so far, and how do you reckon the rest of his term will pan out?
Well, Donald's supporters will tell you, of course, this is the greatest presidency in history. It's been one fabulous accomplishment after another and not a single failure. And that's reflective of how Donald deals with the world. He creates his own reality. He spins fiction in his head. And if you don't believe and accept that, well, fake news. The reality is that he inherited the best economy in the world. The Economist magazine did a cover story last fall, the envy of the world. And that's been squandered now. We have rising unemployment. It's still very low, but it's rising. We have seen GDP, gross domestic product growth, slow, and it's likely we'll be in a recession, according to the big Wall Street houses. We've seen friends turn into, if not enemies, certainly keeping their arm's length from us, as with yesterday's elections in Canada, where the Liberal candidate who stood up to Donald Trump's efforts to annex Canada and make it the 51st state, his party won. They didn't quite win a majority, but they won enough that they will control Parliament. And of course, we've seen that Donald, with his tariffs, claims he has all these deals, but there's no evidence of a single deal. And the leaders in China, who are deeply educated and very long-term strategic, are standing up to Donald. And in any tariff fight between Moscow and Beijing, so long as Donald is in the White House, you'd be wise to vote with Beijing.
Recently, I was talking to one of my senior colleagues, and this was around the time when Donald Trump had started announcing tariffs, reciprocal tariffs. And we were trying to speculate, as journalists, often tend to do, what the response of the world's going to be, how much tariff he's going to impose on countries. And, he said one line which stayed with me. And that line was, it's very difficult to predict that man. There's hardly anybody who can claim to know Donald Trump. But you're somebody who's been covering him for decades now. In your opinion, some of the things that he has done are bizarre. So how about we discuss some of those bizarre things? And let's start with Doge. Let's start with, what was in his mind when he set up this entire, this section. He ceded power to Doge. Elon Musk, he brought him in. This is something unprecedented, never seen before. So where do you think that came from?
Well, Doge, the Department of Government Inefficiency, first of all, is a fiction. Only Congress can create a government agency. But Donald Trump has given Elon Musk and his team free rein to go through sensitive data, to cancel contracts. They've canceled a number of long-term medical research studies on things like cancer and Alzheimer's, just throwing away all the value that's already been put into those. And underlying that is Donald's belief everywhere that he's being cheated. Now, there's a reason for that. Donald and his father made their money cheating other people. Donald, for example, once ordered up from a guy some graphic illustrations for $25,000. And when the person delivered them, Donald looked at it and said, "This is crap," and then put the material behind his desk. And the guy said, "Fine, you still got to pay me." He said, "No, I'm not going to pay you." And he said, "Well, then give it back." And he said, "No, I'm not going to do that either." And he used the graphic material, but he wouldn't pay for it. This was true of lots of things: pianos, furniture, bedding in his hotels. He just refused to pay for it. And he would do the non-payment at a point where it didn't pay to sue him. So if you believe that you're cheating everybody else, why would you be surprised that he thinks everybody's cheating the US? Now, there's a second, deeper element of this. Donald has a degree in economics from Penn, one of the most prestigious colleges in the world. He didn't earn that degree. It was given to him. And he is a firm believer in mercantilism. This was the idea before Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations 199 years ago, 299 years ago, that if you have a piece of gold, I don't have it. So the only way for me to get more gold is to steal it from you. We know how to create wealth now. We're very good at creating wealth. We're not so good at distributing wealth, but we're very good at creating it. But Donald's mercantilism view of the world is, well, if China has money, unless we take it from them, how will we have any money? And it's a bizarre and crazy notion, especially for someone who has an economics degree. But Donald doesn't know anything about economics, and about almost anything else, he doesn't know anything.
Right. Let me take you back to Doge, though, because a lot of people alleged, in the aftermath, once Doge was announced and Elon Musk, started making the kind of announcements that he did right after, is, of course, the fact that a lot of people pointed out that it is perhaps because Elon Musk has a lot of leverage over Donald Trump now, having spent the kind of money that he did during his campaign.
Well, I'm going to speculate a little bit here. Elon Musk put about $250 million, an unprecedented amount of money, into getting Donald Trump elected. And Trump won by just this tiny margin, one of the closest elections in American history. Donald has allowed Elon Musk to overshadow him at times, in the Oval Office to overshadow him. Why would he do that? Well, Donald is on the hook in 2 different civil lawsuits for $600 million in penalties and interest. And those are on appeal. But the question to ask is Elon Musk the person who will end up paying that on Donald's behalf? Donald has bonds he obtained from commercial houses, but there's something in banking known as a back-to-back deal. You are the nominal person who's going to pay this, but there's somebody in the background who will reimburse you. And I think there's good reason to suspect that Donald Trump is beholden economically to Elon Musk. How else to explain that he's allowed him at times to outshine Donald? Because there's one thing Donald can't stand. It's for somebody around him to get more attention or adulation than he does. And by the way, Doge came in saying they're going to save $2 trillion a year. So far, their own numbers, and they're, I think, grossly inflated, come to about $150 billion. But the costs of canceling contracts and firing people come to about $135 billion, according to my former newspaper, the New York Times. So the net savings so far are $15 billion. I think we could describe that as the proverbial drop in a bucket.
Right, right. And also the question is, how much of that saving is real and how much of that is at this point in time, just theoretical. Having said that, though,
or also how much of it is going to damage the economy. I mean, they've cut back on food safety inspections, worker safety inspections. They've cut off drugs that keep some people alive. So there actually may be costs that will undo everything they've done and cost more money than even what they claim to have saved.
But David, I'm sure you'd agree with me. Both Musk and Trump are going to argue the case actually is exactly to the contrary. Having said that, moving on to the next thing, which is, of course, deportation of illegal immigrants. That is something which made headlines, continues to make headlines because of the kind of actions that ICE has been taking. And as there are some bizarre cases which have come out. What would you like to say about, his deportation policy?
Well, Donald is a white supremacist. His family have been white supremacists all the way along. I've written in the past about how Donald was fined for things like removing from a blackjack table a black Puerto Rican and women cocktail waitresses and dealers. So Donald is pursuing his misogynistic white male supremacy views of the world. In the deportations, for when they're U.S. citizens, I think they're more renditions of people out of the country. They have disregarded the law and they've disregarded court orders. We now know that a mother from Honduras who was subject to deportation and who'd been complying with the law, so she could be deported, but she had an order allowing her to stay for the time being, had her two small children with her, one of whom has stage 4 cancer. Those two children are American citizens. They were removed from the country. And Donald has made it very clear that he has no issue in his own mind with gathering up American citizens and throwing them out of the country.
I'm sorry I'm interrupting you, but just briefly, his argument would be, but around this time, 16% African Americans voted for him in this election, which is up from 8% the last time.
Yeah. Donald, the reason Donald has people voting for him, like black young men principally, is because he's the world's greatest con artist. Donald is masterful at selling people things, selling them ideas that are contradicted by his behavior. That's what a con artist does. They get you to suspend your disbelief and your skepticism and to go along. The fact that 15% of Black Americans voted for Donald Trump, first of all, that's a very small minority, but that doesn't excuse his policies, which do not, which violate law. You know, American citizens, the Supreme Court's been very clear for over 100 years, have an absolute right to be in the country. If they leave, they have an absolute right to come back. And he has no legal authority to remove an American citizen. In the case of the Honduran mother, her lawyer says she was told she had 2 minutes to decide what to do. And when she tried to reach out to have her husband, who's an American citizen, get the children, they hung up the phone and forced the removal of her children. This is a lawless administration run by a convicted felon who has a lifelong career of thumbing his nose at the law and getting away with it. I mean, Donald's very, very skilled at evading law enforcement. I've written a lot about that in the 3.5 books I've written about him.
Right. And another one of his bizarre decisions was, of course, to release billions of gallons of water in California after, of course, the wildfire. While local authorities were arguing that this water, of course, would have no impact on the fires and instead could be used by farmers of the state.
Right. Yeah. As a son of California who grew up on a farm, this was absolutely atrocious. The water that was released was not going to Los Angeles to fight the wildfires there. The water ended up causing damage. And it was a loss of water that will be needed later in the season because Donald doesn't know anything. I mean, that's the most important thing to understand. Donald did not know why there was a memorial in Pearl Harbor. I don't know how you can grow up in America or the world and not know about December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. He thought Frederick Douglass, who was from Rochester, where I am right now, and died in 1895, was getting more and more popular every day, thinking he was alive. Donald is just appallingly ignorant about the world. So he thinks releasing the water, that'll help fight the fires. No, and he was told it wouldn't have anything to do with it, but they went ahead and did it anyway because this is a lawless administration and it's driven by fantasy and the fictions Donald creates in his own mind.
Did you come across any reports in terms of, what was the impact of that release of water on the fires?
Yes, that was pretty well covered. The Los Angeles Times, where I worked 40 years ago as a reporter, did good coverage of it. The San Jose Mercury, where I started out as a staff writer when I was still a teenager, they did good coverage of it. The Sacramento Bee. There was a lot of coverage of this misuse of water, which is a very precious resource in California, because by nature would not support a population of almost 40 million people. You can only do that by having these massive water projects to capture and store snow and rain.
And the next bizarre decision, of course, was deciding to rename the Gulf of Mexico. Nobody was expecting it. And what was the point of it?
Well, insisting that the Gulf of Mexico be called the Gulf of America is simply an exercise by Donald in demonstrating his absolute power. What Donald is doing right now is consolidating his power as America's first dictator. He declared on February 26th, he who saves his nation violates no law. And 3 days later, the White House, in different forums, posted images of Donald with a royal British crown on his head and the slogan, "Long live the King." Donald, I've been warning people for 14 years, Donald, if he gets to the White House, wants to be our dictator. And so the Gulf of America and punishing the Associated Press news organization for not using Gulf of America is simply part of, you will do what I say or you will be punished. We've seen that with the arrest a few days ago of a state judge in Wisconsin, and the demands that law firms give Donald up to $100 million each in free legal services. That's extortion. That's all it is. It's just extortion. It's the other side of blackmail, extortion. Donald is working very hard to consolidate his power so that he can be an absolute ruler over the United States. And Abhishek, 14 years ago at least, I mean, the earliest I can find that I said this was 14 years ago. I said that Donald believes he is the only person qualified to be president of the United States and that he should run the whole world. And there were people who mocked me and said, that's ridiculous. Well, he told the Atlantic magazine over the weekend, I run the country and the whole world, confirming exactly that point. That's how Donald thinks. He believes he is special and unique and no one but him. The rest of us, we're all idiots.
Right. And before I talk to you about tariffs and its flip-flop over tariffs a little bit more, there's one more question which I want to slip in, and that is on Ukraine, because Donald Trump, in a bizarre fashion, said that, the aid, if Ukraine, the aid which US has already given to Ukraine, Ukraine would have to trade with the US in rare earth metals. And that was bizarre because, I mean, it's aid after all. How can you later on change the terms? That is something unheard of.
Well, this goes back to Donald's belief everybody is ripping us off because his lifelong work has been ripping other people off. Imperfectly, for sure, but the United States has always stood for liberty and democracy. And we've never sided with tyrants like Vladimir Putin against people who seek freedom. The Russians have been courting Donald since at least 1987, and some individual influential Russians since 1983. No doubt the Kremlin views Donald as an asset. And remember, in 2015, Kremlin sent emails that we now have saying that the Kremlin is going to help you defeat Hillary Clinton. The only thing that any loyal American should have contacted before known, and I would say the same, I assume, in India, saying we're going to help you win an election, is you pick up the phone and call counterintelligence people and warn about this. And instead, the Trumps lied and denied about it for a year. So Donald is very much an asset of the Kremlin. Whether he's an agent is an open question, but he's certainly an asset. And Donald offers of peace for the war have all been the talking points of the Kremlin. In fact, he has said Ukraine started the war, which any rational person knows is ridiculous. So I'm not surprised about Donald's action. He also believes, by the way, that we gave $350 billion of cash to Ukraine. It's about $120 billion, and it's weapons and equipment. So you could argue that American support for the Ukrainians is a jobs program in the United States that employs tens of thousands of people making weapons to help the Ukrainians defeat Russia and prevent Vladimir Putin's well-described and very clear plans to conquer other countries once he rebuilds his military.
Right. And where do you think we'll see that first? Are we going to see that first in the Middle East? Or are we going to see that first in the South China Sea? Where are we going to see that?
Well, because Donald doesn't know anything about geopolitics and military strategy, I think what we should focus on is that other countries run by competent people with competent teams are going to figure out how to deftly rework the world to their benefit. And while I'm getting a little ahead of you on the tariff issue, one of the things that would be a nightmare for the United States would be if the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, or India were to form a free trade zone and exclude the U.S. and deal with China with a little bit of distance, but much more cooperative spirit. And the U.S.'s position in the world would be radically diminished. If the euro were to replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency, that the U.S. gets an enormous subsidy from the U.S. dollar being the world's reserve currency. So there's potential for enormous damage and a reworking of things. China has for many years made it clear that they think they should control the South China Sea. They've been building artificial islands in the Spratly Islands area to support their claims. And Donald doesn't have any appreciation of that. In fact, if someone at a press conference asked Donald Trump, can you show us on the map behind you where the Spratly Islands were, he'd go off on some tangent because he wouldn't have a clue.
Lastly, in terms of how different countries have dealt with Donald Trump since he's come into the White House over different issues, which country do you think so far has been dealing with him in a manner in which Trump should be dealt with? And I ask you this question, of course, because you know the man, you have been writing on him, you've been investigating. So please do share that with us.
Well, the Chinese are the people who have been most resolute about this, followed by the Canadians, who just put in a new parliament and kept the Liberals in power, which 4 or 5 months ago, everybody knew the Conservatives were going to come to power in Canada. Even the Liberals sort of acknowledged that tacitly. But China has made it clear there's no discussions going on with the U.S., and they're going to stand there resolutely, and they don't need the U.S. As much as the U.S. needs China. The jobs Donald is talking about bringing back to America are super low-wage, horrible jobs that they won't be able to find Americans to do. So China has the resources and, more importantly, the deep intellectual geopolitical knowledge and trained experts to adjust to whatever Donald does. There is, of the 200 countries Donald claims that he's working and negotiating with, there's not a single deal. And just as he said he'd stop the war in Ukraine in one day and hasn't, and that one day was the day after his election in November, nobody is dealing with him on the tariffs. He's backing down. Donald is very weak here because he makes these assertions because of his delusional beliefs about his unlimited power. Sort of like the movie The Wizard of Oz. And when Toto, the little dog, pulls the curtain back and reveals the wizard is just a traveling snake oil salesman, a con artist like Donald, everything falls apart. Well, that's what's happening to Donald on tariffs. He's the one who's going to have to back down and come up with new lies to try and explain this to his followers. The tariffs will damage the U.S. economy. They will cost Americans jobs. But more importantly, in the long run, they are turning solid allies like Canada, like Australia, which has always been America's lapdog, into countries that are being now at more of a distance, at a remove from the U.S. It's benefiting China, and it can very much benefit India. India will do better than many countries under Donald Trump because Donald is being paid millions of dollars for putting his name on properties, which I've written about in India. Properties that got amazingly quick approvals when nobody else could in some cases. And he has an affinity for Modi, just as he does for Putin, Kim, MBS, and others who he perceives as strong men who are not shackled or hobbled by notions of responding to democratic rules.
Right. And for the American public, just speculate with me for a second here. When do you think that whale's gonna part and the reality of the salesman gonna come in front of everybody?
Yeah, what the surveys right now are showing is that independents who voted for Trump are pulling away, but Republicans remain solidly behind him. I'll tell you when that will change. America has a national health care program for the poor called Medicaid. It primarily benefits Republican red states because those are the poorer states. And you're going to see news accounts in America of some mother saying, my 8-year-old child is now going to die because of the cuts that the Trump administration made. Or my mother, who took care of the kids so I can go to work after my husband died, she was getting insulin for $25 a month, and now she has to pay $1,000, and that's her monthly income, $1,000. She's going to die. When people's Social Security checks, that's the old age income program. I get a check from Social Security, so does my wife every month. When those checks stop appearing, that's when people are going to wake up. At the moment, even the federal employees who've been laid off, tens of thousands of them, they're still on the payroll. You can't summarily fire them and not reach a settlement with them. So just patience here on the issue, but things will fall apart when Trump interferes with Social Security, with Medicaid, and when we get the spread of infectious diseases, because we have a man who doesn't believe in biological science, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., running the Health and Human Services Agency. We already have measles, which was essentially vanquished, over 600 cases of measles, and they have stopped spending money to contain in foreign countries the MERS virus, which killed every third person who was infected, Marburg, HIV, other viruses, where the US was giving antiviral drugs to people and corralling those diseases in small parts of the world. They're going to spread. And once a virus, a pernicious virus, gets onto a jetliner, they can hopscotch all over the planet. And you're going to see that.
Hopefully not.
That's when Donald's support will begin to slip away among Republicans, when poor Republicans, I don't know why any poor Christians are Republican, but many of them are, they believe Donald is their champion. And when they find out that, no, he's not their champion, he's going to cost them their income or even their lives or the lives of their loved ones, that's when you'll begin to see people begin to wake up. But keep this in mind, Abhishek. It's very hard for anyone who's the victim of a con artist to acknowledge that they've been had. It's mortifying. And people will fight and resist acknowledging they were wrong. They will listen and ask Donald, will explain this to us and give them some story to justify clinging to him, despite all the evidence that it makes no sense to do so.
Right. Last couple of questions, David, quickly. The possibility of Donald Trump trying to get a third term. Is it real, or it's just a story that he has spread out and letting people talk about it in social media and elsewhere? What do you think?
Well, I don't believe Donald will peacefully leave the White House. I mean, the only mistake he's ever admitted to in his whole life is, I never should have left the White House in 2021. And so I don't know exactly how this will play out, but he does not intend to leave office. If he becomes disabled or dies, or he's removed by J.D. Vance, the vice president, and his pals under the 25th Amendment, then I suspect you'll see the same thing with J.D. Vance. But Donald doesn't believe in democracy, and Mitt Romney, the U.S. senator who was the Republican presidential candidate 13 years ago, has said many people, millions of people in my party, the Republican Party, do not believe in democracy. And I think he's right about that. There are a lot of Americans who would rather have a dictator.
All right. And my last question to you, David, you've been a very staunch critic of Donald Trump. And now I will ask you to be a little generous and come up with one thing which you think Donald Trump might have done right. Take your time.
Yeah, I got to tell you that I thought about that before we went on the air, because I thought you might ask me something like that. And he's done something in a backwards way. By ending U.S. humanitarian aid, I think he's drawn a lot of attention to how important that humanitarian aid is to the welfare of the whole world. India, China, the United States, Brazil, everybody. And so I think focusing attention on that has been one of the few good things that he's done. but not the way he intended. It's a backward sort of way of doing it. There's so many other things. Arresting a judge, deporting American citizens, claiming that he doesn't have to obey the law. Those are the things that should deeply trouble us. But I don't see anything he can point to as an accomplishment. The economy's down. The jobs are not growing. Inflation hasn't significantly resumed, but it clearly will, and all the commercial and academic economists will tell you that. And he certainly made a lot of close friends, especially Canada, Australia, and the UK, question their fealty. And I think that's what it's been for 80 years, fealty to Washington. And I'm sure that in Beijing, they're enjoying this greatly because they're a major beneficiary of Donald Trump's incompetence and appalling ignorance.
Right. On that note, David, thank you so much for taking the time and talking to us.
Abhishek, thank you very much for having me.